All right, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 6 this morning, continuing through the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24. Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24. How often do we hear the only thing pastors and churches ever talk about is money? Well, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So let's look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. In the Sermon on the Mount, we've seen Jesus preaching a kingdom-focused message, a message that calls people to focus on things above rather than things below, to have a long-term view of life that's more focused on the heart than just the behaviors that we undertake. Yet, the Sermon on the Mount does deal with questions about behavior. And the focus on eternity isn't something that stops us from being concerned about how we live in this life. It's not as if heaven is good and this life is bad, so we ignore this life and just focus on heaven. But it is the greatness of heaven, the goodness of God's promises, the greatness of Christ's kingdom that motivates us for godly living in this life. And in this section, Jesus focuses on our hearts and their relationship to material things, to money, to our possessions. Now, money is a perfect place for us to focus our minds on eternity because it's something that affects all of us. We all have it. We all need it. We all think we don't have enough of it. It is something that we all deal with. Talking about money is not something only for those who are poor. It's not something only for those who are wealthy. It is something that everyone has a challenge with in this life on this earth. The wealthy are prone to sin as it relates to their finances. The wealthy are tempted to sin as it relates to money. But at the same time, the impoverished are also tempted to sin as it relates to their finances as well. No one escapes this one unscathed. We all have this struggle in one way or another. And as always, the Sermon on the Mount will call us to have a kingdom-focused, Christ-focused mindset that looks at eternity rather than simply looking at the situation in this life. As I said, that doesn't mean that this life does not matter, but it matters in a particular way because eternity matters. So let's look at three things that we see in this text. First of all, we can see that our treasure guides our heart. Our treasure guides our heart. Verses 19 through 21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So Jesus sets up a contrast between two different kinds of treasure. One is treasure on the earth, and one is treasure in heaven. Now, he doesn't condemn treasure on the earth here, but he tells us to focus on a treasure that matters more than treasure on the earth. And he gives us a couple different reasons why we ought to be focused on treasure that's found in heaven rather than treasure that's found on the earth. The first reason is the instability of earthly treasure. Our earthly treasures are unstable. We cannot expect them to last. Now, in one sense, they don't last ultimately because we don't last. So you can have as much money as any human being has ever had, and eventually you will pass away, and that money will be of no value to you. But even apart from that kind of like spiritual focus, we're all going to die anyway, there's a very practical aspect to our money not lasting. The things that we buy, the experiences that we have, they also do not last. Money is ultimately unstable. You can invest a whole lot of money in buying a new car, and the day after you have a new car, you no longer have a new car, you now have a used car. If you then crash that new car 2 weeks later, like I did this summer, that really stinks extra. The things that we have do not last. They are unstable. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have any things. But we must recognize that the things we have are not worth giving our life to because they are temporary. The book of Ecclesiastes largely focuses on this idea with its repeated refrain, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. That word vanity refers to the changing nature of things, the fact that they're not stable, the fact that they don't last. Now, this is not a translation of the word vanity, but I think a helpful picture that you can replace the word vanity with and actually get the point pretty well is bubbles. Bubbles, bubbles. Everything is bubbles. Now, if you're a soccer fan, you might be thinking of West Ham United here. If you're not a soccer fan, that reference makes no sense. But bubbles, what are bubbles? They're things that they last for a little while, and then they disappear. You've all seen kids chasing after bubbles. Why do they chase after bubbles? I don't really know. What are they going to do when they catch the bubble? It goes away. It disappears. That's the same idea that's being communicated by that term vanity. The things that we chase in this world, they're interesting, they're nice, they have some temporary value, but ultimately they disappear. They're gone. They don't last anymore. They're temporary. That is how our money is. That's what the message of Ecclesiastes is. The thing that we strive for on this earth, under the sun, it disappears. Similarly, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says that moths and vermin corrupt, or rust corrodes, depending on how you translate that word. The things that we invest in this life are temporary, so don't give them your loyalty. If you can choose to invest your loyalty in something that doesn't last or something that does last, which one ought you invest your loyalty in? And Jesus' message is that the treasures that you lay up for yourselves in heaven, the things that you pursue of eternal value, are stable and lasting. So chase after them instead of chasing after the instability of earthly treasure. But Jesus also focuses on the heart of earthly treasure when he says in verse 21, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, where we focus so much on the heart, a lot of the time, the way that we frame this, and I don't think this is wrong, is that we focus our heart on doing right and let the good works proceed from the righteous heart. But this verse actually inverts that proposal. It says, where your treasures are, your heart will also be. The treasure actually comes first in this verse. Where you invest your treasure, your heart is bound to follow. Your heart will go where your treasure goes. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we ignore having a right heart. The rest of the Sermon on the Mount is absolutely clear here, but we understand there's a reciprocal relationship between our hearts and our treasure. If our heart is rightly focused, we will put our treasure in the right place. But if we're putting our treasure in the right place, our heart will also be rightly focused. It's not just one comes before the other. They are in a cycle with one another. The place that you invest your treasure, your heart will follow. And there is a warning here because in the Sermon on the Mount, the heart is so heavily emphasized that Jesus here is saying, if you are focused on simply putting your treasure where you want it, your heart will go there also. And he has already made the point that our heart is incredibly important. And so we start by recognizing that our treasure guides our heart. But second, we should see that our generosity reveals our heart. Our generosity reveals our heart. The next two verses. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. If your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? This is a difficult couple of verses. Because you read that, it's kind of like piling metaphors upon metaphors upon metaphors, and sorting them out is actually really, really difficult. And on top of that, it uses some Hebrew idioms that we just don't have in English. They don't translate into English. If you're using an NIV, it gives us some help and a footnote where it says that this pertains to generosity. The Greek for healthy implies generous. Why is that? How does that work? Well, it might help us to look at some other uses in the Bible of this good and evil eye. They connect with generosity and stinginess throughout Scripture. So Deuteronomy 15:9, you don't necessarily need to turn there. And if you do turn there, you got to turn fast because I'm going to start right up here. Deuteronomy 15:9, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The seventh year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will. Literally, do not show ill will. Your eye look grudgingly toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you. You will be found guilty of sin. So the principle here in Deuteronomy, there is a year when debts are forgiven. And this warning is saying, don't be greedy in that year, and don't use that as a grounds for greediness and decide not to give loans to people who need loans because your eye is evil. Saying that you're looking at them with an evil eye, you're being greedy towards them. Proverbs 23:6 is another place in the Old Testament that has this idea. It says, do not eat do not eat the food of a begrudging host. Do not crave his delicacies. So if you're at someone's house and they don't want to give you food, don't eat their food. That's what it's saying. A begrudging host there is someone whose eye is evil. Right? So there, the begrudging host, the host who has an evil eye. That makes no sense in our modern use of idioms, right? But this is an idiom in Hebrew that is saying this greedy host, don't try and take his food. I don't know, maybe he's going to poison you if you take the food he doesn't want to give you or something, but don't take food from a greedy host. Matthew also does this in another place, chapter 20, verse 15. This is one of the parables of the parable of the master who pays the different workers the same amount of money even though they work a different amount of time. It says this in verse 15, don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or is your eye evil? The NIV translates it, are you envious because I am generous? So again, there's this evil eye, good eye, refers to generosity and stinginess. The Mishnah, which is a Hebrew text from shortly after the time of Christ, this is basically the Pharisees writing down their teaching. Now, don't think we use the Mishnah as a particular spiritual authority, but it can help us to understand what is going on at the time of Jesus. And in the Mishnah, it says, a good eye yieldeth 1 out of 40. So 1/40th, and a specific offering it's talking about. A good eye gives 1/40th. A middling eye, 1 out of 50. And an evil eye, 1 out of 60. So if your eye's good, you'll give 1/40th. If your eye's evil, you'll give 1/60th. So again, stinginess is the idea that's being communicated here. So we take that understanding of good eye and evil eye, which I think is what we ought to have, what the original audience would have had in mind when they read this. Let's rethink this. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are generous, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are greedy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? So when we put those idioms in there together, I think we see what this kind of odd mix of metaphors is trying to tell us, that our generosity will actually reveal what is going on in our heart. Jesus says that our treasures, where our treasure is, our heart will be also. Do you want to see where your heart is? You see where your heart is based on your generosity or your stinginess. If you are a generous person, it is revealing that your treasure is laid up in heaven and your heart has followed that treasure, because if you are a generous person, you're showing that you are prioritizing things other than merely the possessions that you have today. Let me ask you, are you a generous person? How? Could this be talking about generosity to the church? Certainly. But it's certainly not exclusive to giving to the church. In general, in life, are you a generous person? When you see a need, do you try and find a way to meet the need, or do you try and find a good reason not to meet that need? I think we very often take that approach. I confess that I often feel that approach. When someone asks me for money, my first thought is, let me think of all of the reasons why I ought not give that person money. And there are times when we ought not give someone money, certainly. But my heart and my own sinfulness is very quick and very creative at finding good reasons not to be generous. Am I every bit as creative in finding reasons and ways to be generous as I am in finding ways not to be generous? That reveals where my treasure is. My generosity of spirit reveals where my heart is oriented to. Because if it's oriented towards this world, the thing that matters most is having more stuff, because that's what matters in this life. But if it is oriented towards heaven, I will be generous with what I have, because I am more concerned with eternity than I am with right now. And so first we saw that our treasure guides our heart. Then we saw that our generosity reveals our heart. And finally, Jesus concludes that our King ought to own our heart. God ought to own our heart. Verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, when Jesus uses the term hatred, he is referring to a comparative hatred. We see that in Luke chapter 14. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Other times, Jesus tells people to take good care of their parents, all right? So he's not actually saying there, you should have a seething hatred for your family. That is not the message of Christ towards our family. However, what he is saying is that you value discipleship to Jesus, following Jesus, more than you value your earthly family. So here, no man can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. So he's saying there has to be an ultimate choice between the two. Which one do you follow, God or money? Again, he is not here saying money is a bad thing. He's not saying don't have money. He's not saying make sure that your employer doesn't pay you because it'll ruin everything. He is saying that money is a bad master. God ought to be the master who you are serving. Now, God, in his generosity, gives us money. And so money is not inherently bad. It is a good tool and a horrible king. And so Jesus says that God owns our heart. We don't need to renounce money. Many godly people in the Bible, some of the key characters of the Bible, be it Abraham or David or Job, are people who have a lot of money. It is not money that is the problem. It is the lordship of money in our life that is the problem. And that is, again, why these verses are not for the wealthy, nor are they for the impoverished. They are for everyone. Because a person without 2 pennies to rub together can worship money. And a person with billions of dollars can worship money. Money can be our master, whether we have a lot or a little money. It's a terrible master. We've all heard money can't buy happiness. Now, studies show that money does make you happier up until you have around $75,000. That was in 2010, so now it's $2 million. Money makes you happier, the study said. There is a point at which you stop worrying about the things that money cannot, that you actually need money for. Because it is hard to not have money. But it is ultimately a terrible master. If we live for money, it will go away. It will decrease in value, as we've all experienced. It's temporary, and ultimately is deceitful. And so Jesus' command is, put money in the right place. Money is a servant, it is not a lord. And so do not serve money, instead serve God. So 3 simple principles Jesus gives here. Our treasure will guide our heart. Our generosity will reveal our heart. And finally, God should own our heart. So let's take a moment in application to ask ourselves some questions. Because we all are going to be tempted in different ways to struggle with money. So, kind of a diagnostic here. Let's ask ourselves some questions about our relationship with money and see if there are places where our relationship with money ought to change so that we are demonstrating that our heart is owned by God rather than finances. First question, are you generous with your money? This is the one that Jesus gives us most clearly here. Are you generous with your money? If you are not generous, it is a very good indicator that money has your heart rather than God. Because God has called you to be generous, and if you will not be so, you are saying that the possessions that you have are more important than the commands that He has given. Are you generous? The next one's harder. Are you worried about money? Are you anxious about money? We'll talk about this more next week when Jesus says, be anxious for nothing. But our relationship with money, if it is one of worry and anxiety, that in and of itself is betraying something that's going on in my heart. If when I have less money in my bank account, I am more worried than when I have lots of money in my bank account, I am trusting in my bank account to provide for my needs, not God. His bank account is not flexible like mine. He is able to provide for my needs in any economy, in any situation, no matter what happens with my job, no matter what happens with my needs, no matter what breaks on my car or in my house or on my body. If I am worried about money, it is showing that ultimately my trust is not in God, but it is in money. And we will talk about anxiety next week, recognizing in some ways anxiety is a natural thing. I ought to be worried about some things because I ought not do some things that are bad for me. And Jesus' response to anxiety is not an angry rebuke, but a comforting promise that God will supply our needs. And so if you are worried and anxious about money, see that as God gently calling you to trust in Him, that He has your life in His hands, that He is in control. He is the one who will provide for your needs, and He will likely use money to do that, and He can make sure that the money that you need for Him to do that is where it needs to be. Question number 3. Is your sense of self-worth tied up in your material possessions? Is your sense of self-worth tied up in your material possessions? Are there things that you need to have so that when other people see you, they know that you have accomplished something? They know that you have something. I was just talking with family from New York this week, where there's a very different relationship with money than we have here. I've mentioned this in California too. It's something about oceans. They make people think this way, I guess. On the coasts, you show that you have value because your car is nice, your house is nice, your lawn is manicured. Whatever it is, the ways that you show it, you show your material wealth. In Wisconsin, you show how cheap you are. That's how you show you have value. You got to show that, yeah, I have a nice thing, but let me tell you what a good sale I got it for. Because if you think I paid full price for that, you're going to look down on me. That is Wisconsin materialism. And it is not any better than coastal materialism. It's not as if we figured this money thing out because we're cheap. That actually goes right against our generosity, right? We ought not find our identity in our money and our possessions, or even in the possessions that we don't have. We do not find our identity in the things that we have. And if I find myself saying, I must have or not have this so that people see me in this light, then we are showing that our self-worth is tied up in material possessions. Our treasure is not in heaven. We are serving money, not God. Next question. Are you willing to sin to get more money? Are you willing to sin to get more money? An idol is anything that you are willing to sin in order to get it. And so if you are willing to sin for the sake of having more money, then you are serving money rather than God. God says, don't lie. If you're willing to lie so that you make more money, you are showing that you care more about money than you care about God. If you are willing to not care for your family as God has called you to care for your family because you will get more money if you ignore them and neglect them, you are saying that money is more important than obeying God's commands for how you care for your family. If you are willing to sin for money, then money has your heart, not God. Next question. Are you jealous of those who have more money than you do? Are you jealous of those who have more money than you do? It's a great indicator of your heart because God says don't covet. And if you're coveting because other people have more money than you, it's showing that your heart is more focused on the stuff than it is on God. Feels like you can be too rich, right? Like when you see someone who has a lot of money, we all have probably said this before, they have too much money for their own good. I remember going to a very, very extravagant house. It was in New York. And so it means it costs like 10 times more than it would have cost here. And it would be extravagant here. I remember walking in and thinking, wow, these people are Christians and they have this house. That feels like that shouldn't be that way. And just kind of pondering on it, thinking about it, like, well, so how much is too much money? How much money is too much money for a Christian to have? Well, I don't know exactly what the number is. I just know it's more than I have. Right? We all might think there's too much money for a Christian to have, and no one draws that line under their own assets. We all draw it somewhat higher than the amount of money that we have. Why is that? Because at the heart of that mindset is jealousy. It's saying that someone else has more than I have. Well, if I had that, I would use it so much better. Just think of all the missionaries I would support if God gave me more money instead of that person who's buying fancy cars. It's jealousy. And it reveals that God does not have our heart. Stuff has our heart. 2 more questions. When you have to choose between money and other good things, what wins? When you have to choose between money and family, money and church, money and whatever, does money always win? Well, that might be telling you something about what has your heart. And one final very practical question. Do you both save and spend an appropriate amount of money. The Bible's not opposed to saving. It encourages it very strongly. The Bible's not opposed to spending either. We recognize you have to spend money. Are you doing both of those things in an appropriate amount? I think that we can be too tight inappropriately, and we can be too spendy inappropriately. Right? This isn't some like really simple black and white, here's what percentage goes to this, here's what percentage goes to this, but it is rather a matter of our heart. Are you willing to say no to pleasures because saving is wiser and more honorable? Are you willing to spend money on people, providing for people, being generous with people, even though that means you might save less? I think both of those are actually appropriate decisions to make in certain circumstances. In certain circumstances, it is most honoring for me to save money. In other circumstances, it's most honoring for us to spend money. If our church was sitting here with $20 million in the bank, I don't think that's a sign that we are effectively fulfilling our mission as a church, unless we have to build like a $20 million building next week. It's about the only reason we should have something like that, because the church's money is supposed to be used for the purpose of fulfilling the Great Commission, for the purpose of accomplishing the mission of the church. So when the church gets money, it ought to use that money wisely, not just create a large nest egg so that we can feel comfortable and not be afraid of the dark times that might come if we were to lose money. Similarly, in my personal budget, I ought to save. A wise man saves. Proverbs makes that clear many, many times. But if I think that having enough money in my bank account is going to provide for my needs instead of God, and I will not spend money, I will not use money for the purpose of accomplishing God's work on this earth, then I actually should probably think twice about my decisions. Saving is not always the right answer. The right answer is for God to have my heart and not my money. For God to have my heart and not my money have my heart. God should have my money. English is hard. I ought to have my heart given over to the Lord, and that will affect my decisions and my finances in countless different ways. The reality of this is, though, again, God deserves my loyalty. Whether I am rich or I am poor, there are competitors for my loyalty to God, and those competitors are found in my wallet. Money will compete with God, and so we must place him in his proper place because he owns us rightly. He is our master, and so we serve him. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you, with wisdom and compassion, teach us so many things. You teach us that there is treasure greater than what is found on this earth and heaven. And so, Lord, with the treasures that you have given us on this earth, I pray that we would live with you as our master, giving appropriately, being generous, spending appropriately, saving appropriately, having integrity in our financial dealings, showing that you truly are Lord, that you are of higher value to us than anything that you give to us. Yet, Lord, we also thank you that you are a generous God. You do give us so much. You do provide so much for us. May we not take the good things that you give us and turn them into idols, but may we serve you and worship you faithfully with everything that you have given us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.